11:47 at night, and the woman everyone feared inside a billion-dollar company could barely stand on her own 2 feet. Chicago's late autumn air was thick with cold drizzle, and the city lights bled across the wet pavement in long orange streaks that seemed to swallow the sound of her own uneven footsteps. CEO Vivian Ashcroft, the woman known across every trading floor as cold, untouchable, and famous for firing executives without blinking, stumbled out of a charity gala looking like a stranger to herself. In the shadows of the parking garage, several men were already watching her, waiting for the moment she would be alone. Patient in the particular way. Predators are patient when they believe no one is paying attention. One by one, the people who should have helped simply walked past and looked away, telling themselves stories about drivers and friends and none of their business. Only one person did not look away. A quiet maintenance supervisor named Adrian Mercer stepped between her and the danger closing in, asking for nothing and expecting no thanks, moving the way a man moves when he has done this kind of thing before and hoped he never would again. He got her home safely that night, never once crossing a line, never once touching her with anything but respect. And by morning the entire building would be whispering about a night nobody could fully explain. The next morning, Vivian walked into the office, looked directly at him across the room, and said the 4 words that would change everything between them forever. I remember everything. Adrian Mercer was 39 years old, and he had built his entire life around not being noticed, a discipline he practiced with the same precision he once applied to loading manifests and supply chains that could not afford a single error. He worked as the facilities operations supervisor at Ashcroft Dynamics, the kind of job that kept the lights on and the elevators running, and never once appeared on anyone's radar during an earnings call, the kind of job most executives forgot existed until something broke. Years ago, he had been married, but the marriage had ended quietly, without scandal, the way most real heartbreaks do, worn down slowly by 2 schedules that never learned how to meet in the middle. Now he lived alone in a small apartment on the west side of the city, a place with exactly enough furniture and none of it chosen for anyone else's approval. Before Ashcroft Dynamics, Adrian had spent 12 years as a logistics officer in the Navy. And that discipline never left him. Not in the way he walked, not in the way he spoke, not in the way he noticed every exit in a room before he noticed anything else in it. He did not attend office parties unless his presence was required for setup and teardown, and he did not flatter the executives who walked past him in the hallway without a glance, because flattery had never once gotten anyone home safely. And yet, among the security guards and the janitorial staff who worked the overnight shifts, Adrian Mercer was quietly, deeply respected because he was the only supervisor in the entire building who remembered every one of their names, their kids' birthdays, the small details that made people feel like people instead of shift numbers. Inside the glass towers above him worked Vivian Ashcroft, 37 years old, sharp enough to dismantle a hostile takeover before lunch, and beautiful enough that people underestimated her at their own peril, a mistake few of them made twice. The financial press had given her a nickname years ago that she never asked for and never denied. The kind of label that follows a woman who refuses to smile for photographers. The Ice Queen of Wall Street, they called her, and she wore the title the way other people wore armor, because in her experience, armor was the only thing that kept anyone from getting close enough to hurt her. She did not trust men easily, and she rarely trusted them at all in a professional setting, having learned the hard way that ambition and affection rarely arrived in the same package. She never drank more than 2 glasses of wine in public, not once, not ever, because control was the one thing she refused to surrender to anyone, in any room, for any reason. Tonight was the company's annual charity gala, an event Vivian had built from nothing into the most talked-about night on the city's philanthropic calendar, a night that raised millions and demanded, from her, an appearance of absolute composure. Adrian was there only because facilities had to manage the loading docks, the catering logistics, the emergency exits, the 100 invisible details that made a glamorous evening possible without anyone in a tuxedo ever noticing the effort. Nobody at that gala, including Vivian herself, had any reason to notice the quiet man in the gray suit standing near the service doors, watching the room the way he had once watched a ship's deck for trouble that hadn't arrived yet. His days at Ashcroft Dynamics followed a rhythm he had set for himself years earlier, and never once broken. Arriving before the sun most mornings to walk every floor before the first elevator carried its first executive upward. He checked the fire suppression systems personally, tested the backup generators himself, rather than trusting the paperwork of a contractor he had never met, and knew, by memory, which loading dock door stuck in humid weather and which one needed oil every autumn without fail. The younger security guards called him the Ghost, not unkindly, because he had a habit of appearing exactly where a problem was about to happen and disappearing again before anyone thought to thank him. He ate lunch alone most days, a sandwich from the same deli 2 blocks from the building, sitting at the same corner table where he could see both the door and the street outside, an old habit that had never quite left him. Executives who passed him in the hallway rarely learned his name, seeing only the gray uniform and the clipboard, filing him away in the same mental category as the potted plants and the elevator music. It was, in its own way, exactly the kind of invisibility Adrian had built for himself on purpose. Because visibility had cost him things once, in another life, that he had no intention of losing again. Inside the ballroom that evening, something happened that almost never happened to Vivian Ashcroft. Something so small that nobody but the man responsible would ever have noticed it. A foreign investor with business interests tied to a pending acquisition made certain, through a server he had quietly paid off earlier that week, that her glass was switched for one considerably stronger than she had ordered. She was not fully intoxicated, not in the way people whispered about the next morning over their coffee, but something in her judgment had slipped sideways, just enough that the woman who counted every step of every negotiation lost count of her own footing on the marble floor. When the gala wound down near midnight, Vivian insisted, as she always did, on walking to the parking garage alone, because independence had always been the one thing she refused to negotiate away. Even now, even like this, she waved off her assistant with a practiced smile. She waved off the valet, with a gesture so automatic it barely registered as a decision at all. 3 men who had been watching her from across the ballroom floor for most of the night followed her down the stairwell, keeping their distance, keeping their patience, the way men do when they have already decided how the evening is going to end. Nobody who saw them assumed anything was wrong, because everyone in that lobby made the same lazy assumption. The same convenient lie people tell themselves, so they don't have to get involved. She must know them. She must be fine. From across the garage, near the loading bay where he had been checking a delivery manifest for the morning's shipment, Adrian noticed the mismatch in her walk before he noticed anything else, and every instinct the Navy had carved into him snapped instantly, completely awake. He crossed the garage without running, because running draws attention, and attention was the last thing this situation needed, not for her safety and not for his own. Adrian walked toward Vivian with the calm, unhurried posture of a man who belonged exactly where he was standing, the posture of someone who had learned that panic solves nothing and calm solves almost everything. When he reached her, he said only one sentence, loud enough for the 3 men trailing her to hear clearly across the concrete space. "Ma'am, your driver is waiting." It was a lie, but it was the right lie, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that made the 3 men reconsider whatever plan they had been building all evening in the dark corners of that garage. They assumed she was not alone after all, that someone official was already handling her. Someone who might notice their faces and remember them later, and one by one they peeled off into the wet Chicago night, without a single word between them. Vivian, disoriented and unsteady, nearly collapsed the moment the adrenaline of the encounter left her body, her knees buckling in the sudden absence of the danger that had been holding her upright, without her even realizing it. Adrian caught her arm just enough to keep her upright, without ever pulling her against him, a careful, deliberate restraint that would define every moment of that long night to come. He immediately radioed the overnight security desk and requested that every camera in the garage, the lobby, and the elevator bank be preserved and logged, not deleted, not overwritten, preserved exactly as it was recorded. He also asked, specifically and firmly, that a female member of the Human Resources night staff meet them at the elevator, because he understood, better than most men would have in that moment, exactly how this could look if he was ever alone with her. Exactly how quickly a rescue could be twisted into something else in the retelling. He kept 3 careful feet between himself and the CEO the entire time, a distance he would maintain for the rest of that long, quiet night, and a distance that would later, on the security footage, tell a story more honest than any statement he could have given. The HR staffer, a woman named Denise Coyle who had worked the overnight compliance rotation for 6 years, met them at the elevator exactly as Adrian had requested, her presence a quiet insurance policy neither of them ever needed to discuss out loud. Together, the 3 of them rode up toward the executive residence floor, where Vivian's penthouse waited. The silence in the elevator broken only by the soft, mechanical hum of the cables, and Vivian's slow, uneven breathing. The building's longtime doorman, a retired police officer named Walter Briggs, confirmed her identity and buzzed them through without hesitation, recognizing Adrian immediately as one of the few facilities staff who had never once given him a reason to worry about anything. Vivian's private physician, a calm and unflappable woman named Dr. Renata Solis, arrived within the hour to check her vitals, confirm there was no serious medical danger, and note quietly in her private log that the patient had clearly been given something beyond simple wine. A detail she would flag privately with security the following day. Adrian stayed only long enough to sign the incident handoff sheet that Denise prepared, his handwriting steady despite the late hour, and then he left the building without asking to be paid, without leaving his name anywhere it did not already appear in the official record, and without a single word to anyone about what he had just done. By the time the sun rose over the Chicago skyline, painting the glass towers a pale, indifferent gold, he had already clocked in for his regular morning rounds as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But something unusual had happened. And buildings this size do not keep secrets for long. Not when a woman as visible as Vivian Ashcroft simply vanishes from a gala and reappears nowhere until well past midnight. The rumor moved through Ashcroft Dynamics the way rumors always move through companies that run on ambition and insecurity in equal measure, growing new and uglier teeth with every retelling before it even reached the coffee machines on the 14th floor. By 9 o'clock, half the leadership team had heard some version of the story, and almost none of the versions bore any resemblance to what had actually happened in that parking garage. Some said the CEO had been seen leaving with an unnamed man, their voices dropping conspiratorially over the sound of espresso machines. Some said she had disappeared entirely, and no one from her own security detail could account for her whereabouts, a claim that alarmed the board more than any quarterly loss ever had. A handful of ambitious junior executives, the kind who are always looking for a crack in someone else's armor to widen into an opportunity, began quietly asking who exactly had been on duty in the parking garage the night before, treating the question like a puzzle they intended to solve for their own advancement. Adrian's name surfaced fast, and just as fast, suspicion attached itself to him. Because a maintenance supervisor being anywhere near the CEO's private business was, in the world of corporate gossip, automatically suspicious, automatically dangerous, automatically worth destroying before it destroyed you. Nobody asked Adrian directly, because nobody ever does in situations like that, preferring instead the safety of whispered speculation over the discomfort of an honest answer. They simply started watching him differently, waiting, some of them almost hoping, to see whether he would be walked out of the building before lunch. The morning leadership meeting had been scheduled weeks earlier to review quarterly numbers, but the moment Vivian Ashcroft walked through the door, every other agenda item in the room evaporated instantly into irrelevance. She looked composed, sharp, and entirely herself. The ice fully reformed over whatever had cracked the night before, her heels striking the marble floor with the same measured rhythm they always did. She said nothing as she took her seat at the head of the long glass table, and the silence in that room stretched long enough that several directors began quietly rehearsing apologies in their heads for offenses they had not yet committed. Their eyes flicking nervously toward the door, her eyes moved across the room once, methodically, the way she scanned a balance sheet for the number that didn't belong, before landing directly on Adrian Mercer, who had been called in only to report on an unrelated elevator maintenance issue, and clearly had not expected to be the center of anyone's attention that morning. She held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that a junior vice president 2 seats down actually stopped breathing. certain he was about to witness a public execution. And then, in a voice that did not waver, a voice that carried across the entire glass room, without ever rising in volume, Vivian said the 4 words that would end the rumor mill instantly and permanently. I remember everything. The room went completely still. The kind of stillness that follows the pin being pulled from a grenade nobody has thrown yet. Every director suddenly recalculating every unkind word they'd whispered that morning. Several people at the table assumed the worst, certain that Adrian Mercer was about to be fired publicly, humiliated, escorted out by security before the coffee had even gone cold on the credenza behind them. A few of the same executives who had been laughing about him in the hallway an hour earlier now sat frozen, suddenly unsure whether their own names had come up in whatever conversation preceded this moment, their smugness replaced by a cold, creeping unease. Vivian let the silence sit for exactly as long as she needed it to, letting it stretch until the discomfort in the room reached its peak, and then she continued, her voice steady and clear enough to carry to every corner of the glass conference room. He was the only gentleman in that entire building last night, she said. And the words landed like a verdict nobody in the room had been prepared to hear. The mood in the room flipped instantly, like a switch thrown in the dark, and the same faces that had braced for someone else's downfall now scrambled to recalculate everything they thought they understood about their quiet, unnoticed colleague sitting near the back wall. Adrian said nothing. He simply nodded once, the way he always did, and waited to be dismissed, because attention had never once been something he wanted, not even attention that arrived wrapped as vindication. Later that same day, alone in her office with the door locked and the blinds drawn against the gray afternoon light, Vivian pulled up every second of security footage from the night before, watching it not out of suspicion but out of something closer to disbelief. She watched the parking garage footage first. The moment Adrian crossed the open floor toward her without hesitation and without fear, his stride unhurried even as 3 armed strangers of intent lingered in the frame's edge. She watched the elevator footage next, the careful 3 feet of distance he had kept between them the entire ride up, a distance that never once closed even when she had swayed unsteadily against the wall and reached instinctively for something solid to hold onto. She watched the lobby footage, where he had waited for Denise Coyle to arrive before allowing the elevator doors to close, refusing to be alone with her for even a single floor, a decision that cost him nothing but patience and protected her completely. Every frame told the same story. A man protecting a woman's safety and her reputation with equal seriousness, asking for nothing in return and taking nothing for himself, not even a lingering glance that might have been forgiven under the circumstances. Vivian had spent 17 years building walls around herself specifically because she had learned, over and over again, in boardrooms and bedrooms alike, that most men saw a vulnerable moment as an opportunity worth exploiting. Adrian Mercer had seen the exact same opportunity and simply walked past it, choosing distance over advantage, and that fact unsettled her far more than anything that had actually happened in the parking garage the night before, because it did not fit any pattern she had ever learned to defend against. Over the following days, Vivian found herself doing something she had never done for any employee below the level of vice president, quietly pulling Adrian's personnel file late one evening and reading through it line by line under the lamp on her desk. She discovered that he had turned down 3 separate promotions to director-level operations roles over the past 6 years, each time citing a preference for hands-on work rather than administrative oversight, a choice that made no sense to anyone who measured a career by its title. Buried deeper in the file was his full military record, more than 20 commendations earned across a decade of service, most of them tied to logistics operations that had, according to the sparse official language, directly resulted in personnel being brought home safely from dangerous postings overseas. One evaluation from his commanding officer, written years before he ever set foot inside Ashcroft Dynamics, contained a single line that Vivian read 3 times before closing the file entirely. He always protects others before himself, the evaluation stated, in the plain, unembellished language the military reserves for its highest compliments. She sat with that sentence for a long time, turning it over the way she turned over contested contract clauses, trying to understand why a man capable of leading an entire department chose instead to spend his days fixing broken elevators and checking delivery manifests nobody else bothered to read. The question followed her home that night, and it followed her into the following week, refusing to let itself be filed away and forgotten the way most curiosities were in her carefully ordered life. And somewhere beneath her usual discipline, a small, unfamiliar restlessness began to take root. The second time Adrian Mercer saved Vivian Ashcroft, there was no parking garage, no drizzle, no danger lurking in the shadows, only a conference room full of expensive suits and a contract worth several $100 million sitting innocently on the table between them. A prominent outside investor named Marcus Holloway had spent weeks pressuring Vivian to finalize an acquisition deal quickly, insisting the terms were standard and the timeline was non-negotiable, and most of the senior leadership in the room had already nodded along without reading past the executive summary. Adrian happened to be present that day only because a facilities matter had required his sign-off before the meeting began, and he had lingered near the back of the room, reviewing his own paperwork, while the lawyers droned on about liability clauses in a tone designed to discourage close attention. Something in the language of one particular clause caught his attention immediately, the exact kind of buried risk allocation language he had spent years learning to spot during his time managing complex logistics contracts for the Navy, contracts where a single missed clause could cost lives instead of dollars. He raised his hand quietly and asked permission to speak, and the ripple of amusement that moved through the room was immediate and obvious, several directors exchanging glances that made their opinion of his interruption perfectly, insultingly clear. Vivian, watching the exchange from the head of the table, made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including herself, and possibly including Adrian. She gave him 5 minutes, holding up her hand to silence the quiet snickering before it could fully take root around the table. Adrian walked the room through the contract clause by clause, explaining in plain, unhurried language exactly how the acquisition's indemnification structure would leave Ashcroft Dynamics fully exposed if the deal ever soured, a risk so cleverly hidden inside legal boilerplate that not one of the 6 attorneys present had flagged it during weeks of review. The room went quiet in a different way than it had the morning after the gala, quiet with the specific embarrassment of highly paid professionals, realizing they had nearly walked their company into a trap set by a man they had underestimated an hour earlier. Vivian ordered the deal paused on the spot, sending the legal team back to renegotiate the exact language Adrian had identified. And by the end of that week, the company had saved itself from a mistake that would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars and years of grinding litigation. For the second time in a matter of days, a man nobody had thought twice about had quietly stood between Vivian Ashcroft and disaster, asking for no credit and expecting no reward, content simply to have done the thing that needed doing. She began to understand that the first night in the parking garage had not been an isolated act of decency, but simply the natural, unremarkable behavior of a man who could not walk past danger, of any kind, without doing something about it. It was Vivian who extended the first invitation, though she told herself for days that it meant nothing beyond simple professional gratitude, a thank you ode, and nothing more. She asked Adrian to join her for dinner at a quiet restaurant far from the office, somewhere neither of them would be recognized by anyone from the trading floor or the society pages that loved to speculate about her private life. He declined the first time, politely, citing the late hour and his early shift the following morning, an excuse that was true, and also, both of them suspected, not the whole truth. Vivian found herself unexpectedly disappointed by his refusal. A small, foreign feeling she did not immediately know how to categorize. She asked again the following week, and this time Adrian said yes, though not, as he told her plainly across the table once they were seated, because of her title or her wealth or the influence she carried across the entire city. He said yes because he had noticed something about her that she had spent years hiding successfully from everyone else in her orbit. Something that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. You have never actually rested, not once. Not in all the years I've watched this company run, he told her. And Vivian, who had built an empire out of never resting, found herself laughing at the accusation instead of denying it, the sound surprising even her. Over dinner that night, Something in Vivian's carefully maintained composure loosened for the first time in longer than she could remember, the way a knot finally gives after being pulled tight for years. She told him about growing up the daughter of a man who measured love in quarterly earnings reports, a father who had taught her that affection was a currency you earned through performance and never simply received. She spoke about the marriage she had walked away from in her late 20s, when she realized her husband had only ever loved the version of her that made him look successful at dinner parties. Adrian told her, in the same quiet, unhurried voice he used for everything, about the years overseas, about the marriage that had ended not in betrayal but in simple exhaustion, two good people who had simply grown into different lives without ever meaning to hurt each other. They spoke about failure without shame, about loneliness without self-pity, about the particular isolation that comes from being the person everyone else expects to be strong all the time. Whether they are wearing a uniform or a tailored suit, neither of them had expected the evening to last 3 hours, and neither of them had expected the careful distance that had defined their entire professional relationship to feel, by the end of the night, like something worth quietly setting aside for once. Vivian walked out of that restaurant feeling lighter than she had in years. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she began to suspect that the wall she had built around herself had just found its first genuine crack, one she was no longer entirely sure she wanted repaired. Their second dinner happened almost by accident. A late night when Vivian's driver called in sick and Adrian, still finishing a final walkthrough of the building, offered to see her home himself, rather than let her wait alone for a car service in the cold. The drive turned into coffee, and the coffee turned into an hour of conversation neither of them had planned. Sitting in a nearly empty diner near the river while the city outside slowly emptied of its evening traffic, Vivian asked him, somewhere in the middle of that second cup, why a man with his record had never once tried to climb higher inside the company. Why ambition seemed to hold no interest for him at all. Adrian told her about a promotion he had turned down 5 years earlier. A director's role that would have doubled his salary and tripled his hours, and how he had realized, standing in the elevator after declining it, that he had spent his entire adult life either serving under someone else's orders or fixing someone else's mistakes, and that the quiet, steady work suited something in him that had never wanted the spotlight in the first place. She found herself telling him, in return, about the year she had nearly sold the company rather than keep fighting for it. A year nobody else in her orbit knew about. Not her board, not her lawyers, only a single therapist she had stopped seeing once the crisis passed. Neither of them tried to fix what the other had shared, and neither of them offered the kind of hollow encouragement people usually reach for in moments like that, choosing instead simply to listen, fully, the way almost no one in either of their lives had ever bothered to listen before. In the weeks that followed, the two of them settled into something neither had a name for, something that lived carefully between colleagues and something else entirely. They took walks along the river on evenings when the office emptied early, saying little, comfortable in a silence that had once felt impossible for either of them to share with anyone. Word inevitably spread through the building, the way word always spreads in places built on glass walls and open floor plans, but this time the whispers carried something closer to warmth than suspicion. Denise Coyle, who had never once mentioned that first strange night to another living soul, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile whenever she passed them in the hallway together. Even Walter Briggs at the front desk began greeting Adrian with an extra nod of quiet approval, the kind reserved for a man who had earned it the hard way. The overnight janitorial staff, who had always trusted Adrian more than they trusted anyone above him on the org chart, began to notice small changes too. The way Vivian now stopped to ask their names when she passed through the lobby late in the evening, something she had never once done in all her years running the company. A woman named Carla Jennings, who had cleaned the executive floor for 11 years without a single director learning her name, told her sister over dinner one night that the whole building felt different lately, warmer somehow. Though she could not have explained exactly why if pressed, Vivian found herself softening in small, almost invisible ways, listening a beat longer in meetings, laughing more easily at things that were actually funny instead of merely appropriate. Nobody could quite say when the Ice Queen of Wall Street had begun to thaw, only that somewhere along the way, she had. Not everyone welcomed the change with the same warmth Denise and Walter carried. And it did not take long for the quieter kind of resentment to surface among the men Adrian had embarrassed in that conference room. Marcus Holloway, still stinging from the collapse of his acquisition and the loss of face it had cost him in front of his own investors, began making inquiries of his own, hiring a private consultant to dig through Adrian's background for anything that might be twisted into a scandal. The consultant found nothing criminal, nothing scandalous, only the same clean, disciplined record that had followed Adrian through the Navy and into civilian life. But Holloway was not a man who gave up simply because the truth refused to cooperate. He leaked a carefully worded story to a financial gossip column instead, suggesting that Ashcroft Dynamics CEO had promoted a low-level employee to a senior title under questionable personal circumstances, letting the insinuation do the work the facts could not. The story landed on a Tuesday morning, and by lunch it had already reached every desk on the trading floor, exactly as Holloway had intended it to. For the first time since the gala, Vivian felt the old instinct rise in her, the urge to retreat behind the ice, to distance herself from anything that might make her look weak or compromised in front of the board. Adrian, when she told him about the article that evening, did not ask her to fight it, and did not ask her to defend him either, saying only that the truth had a way of outlasting noise if people were patient enough to let it. Vivian was not, by nature, a patient woman, and rather than wait for the truth to outlast anything, she called an emergency session with the board of directors the very next morning. She walked into that room and did something she had never done in her entire career, laying out the full, unedited account of the night in the parking garage, the second rescue in the conference room, and the promotion that had followed both, refusing to leave a single detail vague enough for speculation to fill in. She presented the security footage herself, the same footage she had once watched alone behind a locked door, now displayed for the board to see exactly what Adrian had and had not done on both occasions. Several directors who had privately enjoyed Holloway's story shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the footage played, watching a man keep 3 careful feet of distance from a woman who could have destroyed his career with a single dishonest word. By the end of the meeting, the board had issued its own quiet but firm statement in response to the gossip column, and Marcus Holloway found his firm's future dealings with Ashcroft Dynamics quietly, permanently closed. Vivian never mentioned the incident to Adrian again after that day. And neither did he, both of them understanding, without needing to say it, that some fights were worth having, so that peace could simply be left alone afterward. Word of the whole affair eventually reached the rest of the staff in a quieter, gentler version than the original gossip column had intended. A version that painted Adrian not as a scandal, but as the reason the company still had a reputation worth protecting at all. Even the directors who had once laughed at his interruption in the conference room found themselves nodding respectfully whenever his name came up after that. A small, grudging correction that mattered more to Adrian than any of them ever realized. The night of the company's founding anniversary arrived, with all the polish and spectacle Ashcroft Dynamics was known for. A ballroom full of employees, investors, and press gathered to celebrate 15 years of the company's growth and resilience. Vivian stood at the podium in front of the entire workforce and did something no one in that room expected from a woman famous for guarding her privacy, like a vault sealed shut for good. She told them, in careful and measured words, about a night the previous autumn when she had needed help, and one person in that very building had given it without being asked twice. She did not describe her own vulnerability in detail, and she never once used the word weakness, choosing instead to frame the story around a single idea she clearly believed with her whole heart. A company is not built by the people who hold the most power, she told the room, her voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom, without the smallest tremor. It is built by the people who do the right thing when no one is watching, she continued. And somewhere near the back of the room, Adrian shifted uncomfortably, already sensing where this was headed. She then called Adrian Mercer up to the stage and presented him with a newly created title, Director of Corporate Integrity and Operations, a role built specifically around the values he had already been living quietly for years without any recognition at all. The entire room rose to its feet in applause that lasted far longer than protocol required. And for the first time in his career, Adrian Mercer stood in front of a crowd that finally saw him clearly. After the ceremony ended and the crowd slowly emptied out into the cold Chicago night, Vivian and Adrian walked together beneath a light autumn drizzle, neither of them in any hurry to reach the cars waiting patiently at the curb. She asked him the question that had been sitting quietly in her chest for months. The one she had never quite found the courage to voice until that night. Under that particular sky. If that same night happened all over again, would you still save me? She asked, her voice smaller than the boardroom version everyone else knew. Adrian considered the question for a moment, the same careful, unhurried consideration he gave to everything in his life, weighing the honesty of it before he answered. I would save anyone, he told her, and he meant it completely, without a trace of romantic performance in the words. Vivian smiled, the real kind of smile she rarely allowed herself in public, the kind that reached all the way to her eyes without her permission. I know, she said simply. And then she reached over and took his hand. Gently, without hesitation, letting her fingers settle against his. The way a decision settles once it has finally been made. They walked side by side, through the wet reflected lights of the city, that had first brought them together in danger, and now held them together in something entirely different, something neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had somehow needed all along. Somewhere behind them, the towers of Ashcroft Dynamics stood quiet and gleaming against the low autumn clouds, keeping their own kind of watch over a story the whole city would eventually come to know, though neither Vivian nor Adrian felt any particular hurry to tell it. They stopped for a moment beneath the awning of a small closed bookshop, sheltering from a sudden gust of colder rain. And Vivian found herself studying his face in the dim streetlight, the way she once studied balance sheets, searching for something that didn't add up and finding, for once, nothing but honesty looking back at her. She thought of her father, and the quarterly reports he had mistaken for love, and she understood, standing there in the drizzle, that she had spent her whole life building an empire to prove she needed no one, only to discover that the proof had never once made her happy. Adrian did not fill the silence the way other men might have, did not rush to say something clever or reassuring, content instead to simply stand beside her and let the moment be exactly as quiet as it needed to be. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost every trace of the boardroom, softened into something that belonged only to the two of them and to the empty street around them. Thank you for not walking past me, she said. And Adrian answered the only way he knew how to answer anything that mattered, plainly and without embellishment. I could never have walked past you, he told her, and somewhere above them, a single window in the Ashcroft Dynamics tower stayed lit, long after the rest of the building had gone dark for the night, as if the building itself understood that some things were worth staying awake for.